Hello and welcome to my latest video on Tsarist and Communist Russia. In this video we're again looking at the period of 1855 to 1894, so this is the reigns of Alexander II and Alexander III. And we're looking at social divisions in Russia, the nobles, the landowners and the positions of the peasantry and the cultural influence of the church. And we're doing that because it's one of the key themes in terms of what's happening during this period. It is a bullet point on the spec, and most importantly because it is interesting, and the change in Russian society is starting to develop at this point, and this is going to have huge ramifications going forward. The nobles and the landowners have always been a really important part of Russian society. Now, emancipation changed some of this, and it changed some of the things for the nobility in what can be seen as really quite a negative way. A lot of the nobility had started to already face some financial difficulties. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we weep huge buckets of tears for them, because they were still incredibly rich. But the land that they owned was not making the same kind of rewards that they had been getting in the past. And a lot of this was to do with the lack of competitiveness of Russian agriculture. So they were already facing some kind of financial difficulties, mainly because they continued their extravagant lifestyles despite their falls in income. Now, they received compensation from the Emancipation Proclamation, but many spent this compensation on repaying existing debts. So they were compensated for losing land and serfs, but they had already got debt. So it's not money that they had and they then invested in many cases. It's money that they just cleared their debts with. So a lot of them remained to not having those funds to invest in their farms and make them more productive and more profitable. And a lot of them actually didn't know how to either. Noble families, therefore, in some cases ended up selling their land and moving to the towns and the cities. A third of all nobles' land was sold between 1861 and 1905. So this is a really significant shift in this very, very important strand of Russian society. In some cases, local governments, the leading figures in Zemstva and other important roles in local government were left unmanned. So essentially, there weren't enough nobles left in some areas to fulfil the roles that the system had been set up for them to do. This decline did not impact on all nobles, and the nobility retained their social and political dominance throughout this period, and also largely remained very, very wealthy. All of the Tsar's ministers and advisors and army officers were from noble families. Political authority of those nobles who had remained in rural areas was strengthened by Alexander III's introduction of land captains, and again this position was a position that was given to key members of the nobility, and that's from 1889. So there are difficulties for the aristocrats. There is difficulties that leads to some of them giving up their traditional way of life and moving to the towns and the cities. But they still remained the predominant group in Russian society. Now, we talk a lot when we're looking at this period of Russian history about the lack of a middle class. And certainly in 1855, it was pretty much non-existent. It was very, very small and had very little power or influence. Now, industrialization did lead, alongside urbanization, did lead to the size and importance of the middle class growing. There was far more professionals such as managers and bankers and administrators and doctors and teachers needed as the towns grew. And also as the nobility changed its role and its position, and often moving to the towns and the cities, spending more time there or moving there permanently, they required this kind of professional class to work for them and beneath them, and so this class grew. Now, there were also some entrepreneurs who built factories and started businesses, and again, so they emerged. They are very small in number. The introduction of the Zemstva and the urban equivalents, which were known as Dumas, so these are the ones in the towns, not to be mistaken by the national Dumas, which come later, gave the growing middle class an opportunity to play more of a role in local government. And so we start to see in this, actually, some of the middle classes clashing with the nobility and the Tsar as they try to push a new agenda and get frustrated by the old parts of the system old parts of society holding them back. Now, if we compare the size and the power of the middle class in Russia to that in Western Europe, then it's very, very small. It reached about 500,000 by 1897, and that doesn't sound small, does it? It sounds like quite a significant number of people, but it's very insignificant in the context of the overall size of Russia and the Russian population. If you look at the enormous number of peasants, for example, it's very, very small. And Russia actually still looked outside for foreign experts that fulfilled many of these middle class roles. So often they would be looking for managers to run new parts of new industry from abroad. They would be looking for their engineers and all these key roles in building industry. They would be looking abroad. They would be bringing some foreigners, and there would be some training of, and this has helped develop a bit of the Russian middle class, but often because they're constantly looking outside, it doesn't develop naturally and to the same extent as it would have done otherwise. And the middle class thereafter has quite a limited impact on the traditional division of Russian society, which was still basically divided into a small group of nobility and then millions and millions of peasants. The middle class, importantly, had no voice in central government, and all of it was almost non-existent outside of towns and cities. So yes, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, you had a growing middle class, but that's a small part of Russia. And if you look at the vast rural areas, you really wouldn't see it. And still, you are still looking at a society that, as I said, is divided between nobility and peasantry. Feudal, maybe more medieval than something you'd expect at this point in the 19th century. So another group we've got is the urban working class, and this is another group which is starting to grow from very, very small beginnings, often referred to as the proletariat. The working class grew as Russia industrialized. At first, the movement of peasantry to the towns and cities was often kind of seasonal. People would move there temporarily in search for work and then would go back to their village to help out at harvest time. There's a lot about kind of the Russian peasantry recreating the village inside the town, and you'd go and see what should have been kind of urban dwellings, but they've still got farm animals running around in them, and the peasantry aren't really adapting to the way of life. But partly to start off with at first, because it was just temporary. They were peasants. They just happened to be living in the town and working there for a period of time before they were needed back home or anything changed back in the village. Later in the century, this changed, and increasing numbers of peasantry moved more permanently to the towns and cities, especially to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Both have had populations of over 1 million by 1900. Again, quite big, but not gigantic by standards of that period of time. Now, a significant portion of the new urban workers were female. They made up 20% of the workforce in 1885, and then a third of it by 1914. And again, initially, the entirety of this workforce had been male. They just temporarily gone there for work. Now, the conditions in the towns were often absolutely shocking. They lived in overcrowded barracks. They had inadequate sanitation, and all this stuff was kind of provided for them by their employers, and the employers were seeking to spend as little money on this kind of accommodation as they possibly could. The workers ate in canteens. They washed in communal bathhouses. This is something that's got probably more in common with an army camp than really what you'd expect. Those who found private housing rather than that provided by their employer, it didn't find much better. About 40%, of 4 in 10 of these dwellings would not have running water, wouldn't have sewers, but because there was work and there were so many people who were looking for work, the rents were still actually quite expensive, and the demand for housing outstripped supply. And part of this, and this often happens in the period of urbanisation, is that it is following the demand. So the demand's there, and the housing will eventually follow. But Russia maybe wasn't in the position to get everything ready and be prepared for it. And we've got overcrowding and we've got terrible conditions, when actually, considering the amount of room there was, it seemed to be slightly unnecessary. Now, the Tsarist government wasn't completely without any empathy or any attempts to help things for the workers. But the reforms they brought in were very limited in what they did. A lot of it is aimed at protecting female and child labour. So nighttime employment of women and children was prohibited in 1885. In 1886, workers had to be employed by contracts approved by factory boards, so just checking on the degree of exploitation. Again, it was still largely weighted in favour of the employers rather than the employees. And the employment of children under 21 was banned, and female labour was banned in mines. So again, in one of the workplaces of the worst and harshest conditions, we've got again protection of young men and children and women. The government, however, was reluctant to go as far as what was happening in other countries in Europe, most notably in Germany and then later in the UK as well, or around this time in the UK and going even further later, as they feared that if they intervened too much, then this would drive up the cost of labour, and this would frighten off foreign investors, and they were really reliant. The economy was really reliant on these foreign investors, and also the Russian businessmen. Because remember, they're trying to develop this entrepreneurial idea of business and commerce, and so they didn't want to crush it before it really develops by increasing the cost of labour. Now, because things were so bad, you would have expected things to have come to a head quicker. You'd expected more problems, more demands, more protests. But actually, and this is it's quite sad really, the Russian peasantry was so used to a very harsh life, very hard work, and very little in terms of comforts and sanitation and all the rest of it, then they didn't demand better conditions particularly, especially as they were in a competitive market. The supply of labour easily met the demand for work. Between 1886 and 1895, there were only 33 strikes per year. This is relatively low. So the reaction of the Russian workers to the state of their conditions is not as strong as we might, looking at it from a modern perspective, expect. The peasants back in the rural areas, well, there was a gap developing. There was a gap between the richer and poorer peasants, and this grew wider and wider. Now, some of the peasantry did really well. Now, this particular group of peasants are known as kulaks, and these are going to be a really important part of the story as Russia develops, and they're going to do quite well in this period, but they're really going to suffer when we get to the time of Stalin, when we look at communist Russia. These were the peasants who took advantage of the great freedom of emancipation. They invested in buying more land. They started using new methods of production. Sometimes they would borrow money from the peasants' land bank. Many actually got to, some of the kulaks got to the point where they're actually employing other people, other poorer peasants as labourers. And they also did some quite cynical and clever, but maybe slightly evil things, where they acted like a pawnbroker, where they would buy grain from the poorer peasants in the autumn, and this would give the peasants enough money to survive the winter, and then they would sell this grain back to them in the spring, obviously having inflated the price and put a really serious markup on it. So the kulaks are not always very popular with their poorer neighbours, even if their poorer neighbours do rely on them for food and work occasionally. So we might see, or we will see, the ramifications of this later down the line. The peasants who didn't do so well then, well, and this was the case for the vast majority, they were burdened with this really high taxation, with the redemption payments. They were farming very, very small plots of land, and so they were struggling to survive, let alone to thrive and grow and do what emancipation was supposed to lead to. So many of them moved to the growing industrial towns and cities and competed for work there. Both those who stayed and those who left faced real hardship. Some of this was made worse by the government with the forced selling of grain in the late 80s. We shall not eat, but we shall export. and this left many of the peasants starving, and it culminated in that terrible famine of 1891 to 1892. Average life expectancy for the peasantry at this point in time was below 30, and again, as I always stress to my students, this doesn't mean that the aging process was massively ramped up. What it meant was because diets were so poor, because of starvation and malnutrition and disease, then many people died whilst they were very young. Child mortality rates were incredibly high. And the other thing that really demonstrates how bad this was is that many of them were actually unfit for military service. So they were looking to be conscripted, and then they go, well, you can't come and fight. You don't have the physical capability to do so. Now, some of the Zanster tried to provide some healthcare and education to the peasants, but again, this is a drop in the ocean compared to the needs of the time. It's not a uniform picture across Russia. The Russian heartland between Moscow and St. Petersburg is particularly overpopulated, and this meant smaller and smaller land holdings, as every male in the village in the Mir was supposedly going to get a piece of land, and therefore the land kept on getting divided into smaller and smaller bits. Elsewhere, like the Baltic states, the western Ukraine, the northern Caucasus and western Siberia, where overpopulation wasn't an issue, then the commercial farming started to develop, and here the peasantry did better. And again, so there's maybe less as a surprise that it was the peasantry of the places around Moscow and St. Petersburg that are drawn into the city looking for work, because there simply isn't enough land to survive. The Russian Orthodox Church plays an incredibly important role in supporting the Tsarist system. It taught everybody that the Tsar was appointed by God, and the Russian people therefore should accept the conditions on earth as the will of God. So the word of the Tsar was like the word of God, and the fact that the Tsar lived in a fabulous palace or palaces and you lived in terrible conditions was the will of God, and if you put up with it, then you would be rewarded in heaven. The Patriarch of Moscow, who's the leading church in the Russian Orthodox Church, was a close advisor of the Tsar. The Over-Procurator of the Holy Synod was a government minister appointed by the Tsar to run church affairs. This position was held by Pobedonostsev from 1880. So ultimately, the Tsar had control over church appointments, finances, and administration. But often these people he appointed, the likes of Pobedonostsev, had an enormous influence on him. And it tended to be a very, very conservative one. And it's one that played on those traditional roles of the Tsar and told him that essentially everybody had to do as he told them, and things were as they were supposed to be. And therefore, that reform was basically a bad idea. The church is also crucial in maintaining control over the peasants, and this was a particularly important role it played in the Tsarist system. So by telling the peasantry that essentially it was God's will that they suffered and were poor, and that the Tsar told them what to do, then they were less likely to rebel. When a report was published in 1858 that said the quality of education and ability of the rural clergy was a major concern, Alexander II was worried, and in the midst of everything that was going on with emancipation, he was worried that the church would lose control of the peasantry. And he set up an inquiry looking into church organisation and practices, but in effect this did very little to improve the quality of local priests in the rural areas. But the church did, particularly in rural areas, continue to keep its grip. This grip that the church has, however, was weakened in several different ways, and sometimes it was weakened and it remained weak, and it's a progressive thing, and in other times or other aspects it was weakened and then returned. So education is an important aspect of this. So Alexander II removed control of the education from the church and gave it to the authority of the Zemstva in 1863, and the aim was to make schools more forward-thinking, to get technology and science and things into the curriculum and help Russia advance. However, under Alexander III, access to education was restricted through higher school fees, and only schools allowed to expand were parish elementary schools controlled by the church, meaning that the church's control over education remained and became strong and significant again. And Alexander III associated education with Western liberal ideas and challenges to him. So education though would help progress by Tsars, was also seen as bringing in opposition. And this was then a very difficult balancing act for autocracy, because if you gave control to the church, then the church would educate people to obey you, but you're not going to get that kind of new flux of ideas that can help progress and economic growth. But if you have let in lots of ideas that can help economic growth and progress, then you're probably also going to let in ideas that suggest that people shouldn't listen to you and give alternative ways in which the country could be run. By 1894, the Orthodox Church remained an important role in Russian society, particularly in the rural areas. However, its grip on Russia was weakening as Russian society industrialized and urbanized. The church had less influence in the cities, and many workers were increasingly attracted to the atheist ideology promoted by radical socialist groups. And this is largely due to the fact that essentially they could say, well, what had the church really done for them? However, I wouldn't overstretch this too far, because the church still had a big hold over an awful lot of the Russian people. But in the cities, in the towns, and this is an important bit, with the rise of opposition groups, it was weakening. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been really helpful for you. If it has been, then please hit the like button. If you think there are others you know who would benefit from seeing it, then please share it. If you haven't done already, then please subscribe. And on the channel you will find not only lots more videos on Tsarist and Communist Russia, but on other aspects of history and also on A-level politics. And please help us grow and continue to support everyone in their studies by subscribing. Thank you again for watching.